I'd like first just to say the blessing over Torah study as we're about to embark on this. And I know we're all separate, but feel free to say it with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so as Gabriel read the introduction, this is what we're going to start talking about. But the way I want to frame this is in a series of questions. And so our first question that I want to ask, is that given that some people are choosing to forego immunization, do we have an obligation to get vaccinated in the first place, right? We can talk about vaccines, but if there's no duty or obligation to get it done from a Jewish perspective, then the discussion is kind of moot. It's kind of irrelevant. So we're going to dig into that and see, is there an obligation? And if so, where does it come from? Then we're going to talk about how do we allocate these vaccines? How do we distribute them? Especially today when there are so many people that need it and we don't have enough vaccines for everybody. We're fortunate in the United States that so many vaccines have been developed, and this is true in a lot of Western countries, that whereas before, even in January, allocation was a really serious consideration, and it still is, but we're at a much better point right now where President Biden, for instance, came out yesterday and said that by May, every adult who wants a vaccine should be able to get one. So this question is relevant, but it might not be as relevant to us in Western countries. But it's still a relevant question because for countries who are poorer, according to one study, not everyone is going to get vaccinated until 2024. So it's still a relevant question, and it's a question we need to consider. Third, how do we consider people that are battered by poverty and beaten by racism, right? They're already at a disadvantage. They tend to be poor, have worse health outcomes, and have less access to healthcare. So does that mean that we have a greater responsibility to them? Should they have more priority than other people? These are all questions that are important to consider. And then last is basically the takeaway. What does this all mean for us? How do we respond to these questions, and how do they impact our daily lives? So we're going to start with this first question. And I think the answer is yes. In fact, I'm positive the answer is yes, from a Jewish tradition, that we do have an obligation, and we're going to look at where does that obligation come from. And the first really big idea, I think, here is that there's this idea of the supreme value of life. Excuse me, forgot to turn my phone off. I apologize. Good thing it's not high holiday services. That would be worse, I think. So the supreme value of life, what is that? Well, we have this Mishnah, which is essentially the earliest oral law that we have in rabbinic Judaism. So this is a rabbinic text, and here's what it says. The first human being was created alone, meaning Adam was created alone, right? There were no other people when he was created. It was just Adam. So the first human being was created alone to teach you, meaning us, that regarding anyone who causes one human being to perish, the verse counts him or her as guilty, as if he or she were to destroy an entire world. So if one person kills another person, the killer is likened to a person who destroyed an entire world. And this is a very famous text, so I think we're familiar with it, but it's still important to go through it because of its implications for what we're talking about today. Now we go to the flip side. And regarding anyone who saves one human being, the verse counts him or her as if he or she were to save an entire world. So on the one hand, if you destroy one person, this is like destroying the entire world. On the other hand, if you save one person, this is like saving the entire world. And what this shows essentially is that that one person is an entire world, that one person has value beyond the individual, that this value is infinite almost. So one person isn't one person is everything and more. So if that's true, how do we allocate vaccines when everybody is infinite, has infinite value? So that's the first part that we need to understand. But what this shows us, at least, is there an obligation to get vaccinated? Yes. Why? Because Judaism says that human life has infinite value, and vaccination can save life. So here's this question again. What obligates us to seek vaccination? Well, we have another answer. And there's the mitzvah to save life. So it's not only that our lives, each and every one of our lives, is of infinite value, but that we also have an actual commandment. You are commanded to save life. And where does this come from? So this is coming from another rabbinic text. So this is a theoretical situation, right? The rabbinic Judaism often does this. It comes up with cases or ideas, hypotheticals, and then tries to work out what we would have to do based on what we know about Torah. And this is one case. From where is it derived that one who sees another drowning in a river or being dragged away by a wild animal or being attacked by bandits is obligated to save him? Right? So if we happen to walk along and someone is drowning in a river, or there happens to be a lion or some type of wild animal, right, attacking someone, why do we have an obligation to save them? And this the question that they're posing, it's a little out of context, but it comes from a larger discussion where they've decided that we do have an obligation already. The question is, why do we have one? And here's the answer. The verse states, "You shall not stand idly by the blood of another." This is a very famous verse, right? We don't stand idly by. We aren't supposed to be bystanders. And the Gemara, which is this rabbinic text, right? You have the Mishnah and then the Gemara. The Gemara is the commentary on the Mishnah, so to speak. So it expands it more. It's also rabbinic and it comes later. So the Gemara, meaning this commentary on the Mishnah, is asking about this. It says, is this really derived from here? Meaning, does the verse, "You shall not stand idly by," right? Essentially, does that actually mean that we have an obligation? Can we derive that from there? Does that verse actually support that? So the question is, how do we go back to the text and find verses to prove our positions, right? Or to prove what we think is true. This is one of the distinctions between Jewish medical ethics and secular medical ethics. Secular medical ethics is, quote unquote, secular. We use law, ethics, which are universal. We don't use religion necessarily, and they're different assumptions. In Jewish medical ethics, we assume from the get-go that God is in charge, that authority comes from Torah. So we have to go to the texts and find reasons and stances in them, which is why we're dealing with the text so much. So is this really derived from here? No, they say. It's actually derived from somewhere else. And where's that from? It's derived from the fact that the Torah teaches that one must return lost property to its rightful owner. Okay, so this is a little strange. We're first talking about saving life, and now we're talking about property. What's going on here? Okay. So from where is it derived that one must help his neighbor who may suffer the loss of his body or his health? This is where that verse comes from. The verse states, "And you shall restore it to him." So this verse is actually dealing with lost property. But what the rabbis are doing, they're being very creative like they typically do. They reread that verse and they're understanding it in a different way. Yes, this verse talks about restoring property to people who have lost it, but it doesn't just mean that. It also means that we have an obligation to restore it, meaning a person's body, a person's health, to them as well. And that's exactly what they say, right? Which can also be read as, "And you shall restore him to him," saving his body. So essentially this verse means that we actually don't need that other verse. There's no need to say, "You shall not stand idly by the blood of another," because this verse in and of itself says that there is an obligation to save others, to rescue others. So we've already established that life is of infinite value. It makes sense, therefore, that we have an obligation to save life because of it's of infinite value. And it's not just an obligation, it's a religious commandment, it's a mitzvah. Any questions so far? I'm keeping watching out for the chat. I don't think I see anything yet. Okay, cool. So let's keep moving. So this question again, why do we need to be vaccinated? Now here's the different question. We've established life is of infinite value. We've established that we have an obligation to save life. But in that previous text, it was about saving other people's lives, right? If I see a drowning person, if I see another person being dragged away by a wild beast, the question now is, do we have an obligation to protect our own lives? And that's the question we're dealing with when we come to vaccination, right? Do I have an obligation to protect my own life? From one perspective, this actually isn't a different question, because we know that COVID-19 spreads, it's contagious. If I don't get vaccinated and I contract the virus, I can spread it. And if I spread it to someone else and that person dies, I have killed one person in a way, right? It's not identical to saying that you have killed a person and therefore you've killed the entire world. That is talking about intentional murder. This is different. But what is true is that your actions have indirectly caused another person to die, and you have an obligation to save life. And by not getting vaccinated, you do not fulfill that obligation. So in one sense, this question, do we have a mitzvah to protect life, isn't a different question. On the other hand, it is. And so do we have an obligation to protect our own lives? And the answer is yes. And where does this come from? It's a positive commandment for a person to build a guardrail for his roof, as Deuteronomy 28 says, you shall make a guardrail for your roof. So again, this is coming from rabbinic Judaism. We have this verse, and they're basically asking, okay, what is this about? Why do I need to make a guardrail for my roof? Because the Torah doesn't explain it. And they're saying that this requirement applies to a roof and similarly to any place that might present a danger and cause a person to stumble and die. Okay, so for example, if a person has a well or a cistern in his courtyard, he must erect a sand wall 10 handbreadths high around them, or make a cover for them so that a person will not fall in and die. Okay, so we have to protect other people. Okay, so let's keep going with this. How does this apply to ourselves? Similarly, it is a positive mitzvah to remove any obstacle that could pose a danger to life, and to be very careful regarding these matters. As Deuteronomy 4:9 states, beware for yourself and guard your soul. If a person leaves a dangerous obstacle, which is what we were talking about a second ago, right? If you have something that, like a cistern or a well, or you have a high place and you don't have a protective guardrail, this is like an obstacle in a way, right? It poses a danger. So if a person leaves a dangerous obstacle and does not remove it, he negates the observance of a positive commandment and violates the negative commandment. Do not cause blood to be spilled. So what we see here is that this applies also to ourselves. Why? Deuteronomy 4:9. Beware for yourself and guard your soul. We're not talking about other people now. We're talking about ourselves. So it's not enough to put a guardrail up because I worry about other people. The guardrail is also to protect your own life. You don't leave an obstacle for yourself in the same way that you don't leave obstacles for others. So now we know life is of infinite value. We have an obligation to save life, and that obligation extends to ourselves, which means we need to protect our own lives. And so we come to vaccination. So this comes from Rabbi Elliot Dorff. He's a giant in the conservative movement, especially in medical ethics. he writes, with its strong sense of community and duty, the Jewish tradition would have us use communal measures to preserve our lives and health as much as possible. It would be a violation of Jewish law, for example, for a Jew to refuse to be inoculated against a disease, at least where the inoculation has a proven track record of effectiveness. Jews, on the contrary, have a positive duty to have themselves and their children inoculated against all diseases, where that preventative measure is effective and available. So spot on. We've traced some of these texts. We've now come to the application. We've established life is a value that can't be measured. We've established we have a duty to save life. We have a duty to save our own lives and protect it. And what does this mean? Vaccination. But based on this paragraph, we have a little problem. So does anybody have any idea what that problem is, just looking at this paragraph? And feel free to type it into the chat. What's the issue? And you have to think not necessarily just about this paragraph, but the situation we're in and how the vaccine was developed. This might be giving away too much with the question, but what could be a potential issue here? So what I'll do is I'll probably wait like about a minute or so, I think. Yeah, we're good on time. And then we'll see if there are any replies. Looks like I see some people typing, which is good. Yes. Chat, let's see what we have. Autonomy and judgment, say Mel and Robe. Okay, so autonomy, judgment, meaning is the vaccine safe? Is that what you're saying? Okay, good, very good. That's exactly what I was pointing at, and I think that's exactly what is directed at here. So why? The inoculation has to have a track record of effectiveness. So we're in a different situation now, right? One major reason, I think, and what surveys have shown, that a lot of people don't want to get vaccinated in this particular instance, or are hesitant to do so, is because of the process by which the vaccine was, or vaccines rather, were created. Vaccines have never been created in such a fast way. No, I don't think money has been poured into it to the same extent that it has in this. So it's been fast, and people are worried about whether the same critical rigor that characterizes the development of other vaccines has been applied here. And that's a good worry. If it hasn't, the vaccine might not be safe, right? It might actually be bad. It could kill you. So these are reasons that people worry about. However, what we know is that these are worries, but they're not actually, they're legitimate worries, yes, but they don't apply here in the sense that we may have these worries, but nothing was actually rushed. What we know is that the process was expedited, yes, but it wasn't, corners weren't cut. What ended up happening, and I'm not a government official, so I can't say everything, but I can say that having read some of the literature on this, that there were red tape was cut, for instance. One of the reasons that it was developed so much more quickly also is because we had so many more people working on it at the same time. So typically that doesn't happen. So if you devote the world's resources, which is really what happened, to solving this issue, you're going to get a lot more manpower, and you're going to be able to do a lot more testing, have more studies in a way that you wouldn't before. So I can't articulate exactly why it's safe in that sense, right? Why the process was being able to be expedited. But what I do know is that the experts are telling us it's safe. And Judaism also tells us that we have a commandment to listen to the experts, to science. And the Orthodox community, this is a responsum, which is basically a people send in questions to rabbis and they receive answers. This is an answers from an Orthodox rabbi who's also a major figure in the Orthodox movement. And here's what he says. The efficacy and safety of the COVID-19 vaccine has been attested to by thousands of medical experts, as well as the governmental health agencies and authorities in many developed nations. There is no basis for concern about serious side effects on vaccine-associated deaths. The other thing I forgot to mention is of the many thousands of vaccines that have been delivered so far, the numbers of deaths are, I believe, below 10, right? So this vaccine by actual number standards is in some cases is actually safer than past vaccines. So it's not only that, yes, it was developed quickly, but it's safe. And in fact, it's more effective than many vaccines have been. The fact that some of these vaccines are 95% effective is mind-boggling. So we have legitimate worries, but we have an obligation to listen to the experts. We're not physicians, unless you are, which might be a case. You can say more about this than I can, but expertise is something that we respect because they're experts. They know what they're talking about. And in Judaism, an expert is what we call a baki, and we have a certain respect for them because Torah gives them a license. They have this knowledge that we don't have, that we don't understand. So maybe we don't understand how it was done, how this vaccine was developed so quickly, but they're telling us it's safe. And the statistics show it's safe, and we have an obligation to trust them, not only because Torah commands it, but also because other lives are at stake. Now, I see that there are two comments. Let's see what we have here. Proven track record. Yes, that's exactly right. Yep, very good. For the question I asked earlier. Thank you. So, good question. What justification has our Hasidic brethren used to avoid health precautions, i.e. masking? That's an excellent question. So I can tell you that I've looked for this and a little bit. I haven't been able to search this in detail. I think there are a couple different reasons. The first one is that there is a distance, so to speak, not a real distance, right, but a metaphorical distance from science. One of the distinguishing features of the Hasidic community is in a sense that they live in a pre-modern world, right? I mean, yes, they have electricity, yes, they live in our world, but not really. The laws and the worldview by which they operate aren't contemporary. So science existed, but it doesn't have the same authority. So that's the first thing. The other issue is that religious commandments are to be taken very seriously. Now, we also know from Jewish tradition that if there's a commandment that will endanger your life, or a commandment that if you fulfill it, someone will have to die, you don't fulfill that commandment. So there's actually in the literature, right, that if it's a choice of observing Shabbat versus saving life, you save life. It's very clear. I think the question is the fact that because of this skepticism of science, this distrust of science in the Hasidic community, the fact that it's also not a priority, and that religious life is a priority, right? That it would be inconceivable. In fact, it's not halachic. You can't, the way that we're doing this right now, and the way that you might be attending services online, for instance, you can't do that. It's not possible. To do that, if you were to log on to Zoom and attend services on a Friday night or Friday morning, that would be the same thing as eating pork. It's identical, right? You're breaking the law. That would be the same thing as stealing. Not the same importance, maybe, right? Because you're actually harming another human being, but they are identical. So I think the idea is that if we're going to have a minyan, if we're going to actually live our life as religious Jews, which requires community, we can't have this stuff. And in fact, we really don't care about it too much because we don't believe it necessarily, right? I think that's where it's coming from. I'd have to do more research on it though, but that's my answer of how I feel about it. But don't quote me on it. Let's see, any other questions? No, looks good. Okay. Let's move forward. Okay, so here's a question I wanted to ask now. Given all this, may Jewish institutions require vaccination as a prerequisite for participation in future life? Or excuse me, in future live, meaning not virtual programs, right? So even though that there's this Jewish obligation to get vaccinated, we know that, you know, unless you're Orthodox and are really concerned with observing halakha, the Jewish law plays not as a significant role, right? It might be more of a guide. It might just be another consideration depending on whether you're conservative or reform or anywhere along that spectrum. So even though there's a Jewish law, it doesn't mean actually that we're going to observe it. And this means that there are going to be plenty of Jews, I think, that aren't going to get vaccinated. And the question I'm asking then is, given that from a Jewish perspective, from the tradition, we have an obligation to get vaccinated, can Jewish institutions actually require people to get vaccinated and say, if you don't get vaccinated, you can't come to temple when we resume? If you don't get vaccinated, you can't come to the community center. So what do you think? Ah, good. We already have a response. So can we continue to require masks and social distancing? I think that's another question, right? And I know that, or at least from what I've heard from Fauci, and I don't have a direct line with him, obviously, but from reading and watching the news, right, that he thinks that we're probably going to be having some form of this until 2022, I think. So I think that's true, right? Can we also require that? Maybe that's an additional question. Or maybe, right, if you choose not to get vaccinated, you have to wear a mask, right? So there are different ways of maybe even approaching this problem, right? Maybe there's a medium that we can approach, right? You don't get vaccinated, okay, but wear a mask, otherwise you can't come. That's one way. Yeah, let's see. No more. Okay, let's just check the time. Good, okay. And if there are other oh, great, we've got another one. So a medical doctor told Kavod that in the US, we can't force people to get vaccinated, same as with the flu, but if not, you have to wear a mask. Okay, great. I'm glad you made this point. So one of the things we also have to understand is that we live in America, right? Where there is theoretical, and I think it's true for the most part, a separation between church and state. So what we think as Jews, right, the Jewish law doesn't necessarily apply here, right? That there are laws by the country and we obey those laws. This is a rabbinic notion called dina de malchuta dina, meaning the law of the state is the law, or the law of the land is the law, right? So with regard to non-religious matters, right, questions of health, civil issues, when we live in other countries that aren't Israel, the law of that country is the law. So in this case, the law of, apparently the US can't force people to get vaccinated. Okay, so we can't make a law contrary to that, not only because it would be illegal from a secular legal perspective, but also because it contradicts Jewish law. The law of the land, America, is the law. So in this case, we can't do that. But apparently we can say you have to wear a mask. That's interesting. I don't know how that works. Will vaccine passports be an impetus for people? Oh, okay. So will vaccine passports be an impetus for people to vaccinate? An incentive to fly, attend services, etc.? It's a good question. I don't know. I think that could be it may very well, right? Because I know there are other countries that maybe they're taking a different tact. And if that's the case, I would think if you really want to go somewhere, that it would be an incentive, right? That it would be a requirement. What I can say, at least from the Jewish perspective, and that I don't know if Israel has actually made a law on this, but from the Jewish halachic perspective, the answer is yes to this question. We have responsa again, right? So these are these back and forths where someone poses a question and then the rabbi poses an answer. where this question is asked. The Reform movement replied to one such question, I think about 2 decades ago. There was a question about whether a student whose parents refused to give him vaccination, whether the school could deny him entry. There was another question in the conservative movement from about 2005 on a similar type of topic. And for the most part in these cases, the answer is yes, you have a requirement, or not a requirement, but you have permission to do this. That from a Jewish perspective, you can do this. I think one of the interesting things about this that might be different is that the cases there were religious schools, right? Which, unless I'm wrong, aren't under the control of the state, right? So if Sunday school, for instance, can we require people to get vaccinated? I think there we might have more pull. Again, though I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. But I think there are areas even here in the United States where this might be something we can actually require. And the question is, do we have an obligation to do that from a Jewish point of view? And according to tradition, for the most part, I think the answer is yes. Just looking here, looks good so far. Okay, let me see. Why? Good. Great. I don't think, Gabriel, you didn't just send me another message, did you?
No.
Okay, great. Cool. Just wanted to be sure. Something was flashing and then it went away. Okay, everyone good so far? Excellent. Okay, so this brings us to our second question, which I think is a more difficult question, not because it's less important or more important, but because the sources are more divided on this. So again, in medical ethics from a Jewish perspective, we go to the sources, right? What does tradition tell us? And tradition tells us conflicting things. What's the joke, right? Ask 2 Jews for their opinion, you'll get 3. So that's kind of where we are here. So it's a little less clear, but there are in general some trends to follow. So we're going to see how do we do this. And again, we've got to go to the texts. So we're going to start with the Talmud. And again, the Talmud is the Mishnah, right? The first beginning of the oral law, combined with commentary. So here we have the Talmud. If 2 people were walking on a desolate path, and there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them, and the situation was such that if both drink from the jug, both will die, as there is not enough water. But if only one of them drinks, he will reach a settled area. There is a dispute as to the halakha. So we've got an issue, a situation here, basically where 2 people are walking along in a deserted area. They're far away from civilization. There's no water immediately available other than the water that they have on them, a water jug. And there's not enough for both of them. There's only enough for one. What do you do? And there's a split. According to Ben Petora, it's preferable that both of them drink and let neither one of them see the death of the other. Okay, so both drink, both die. This was the accepted position until Rabbi Akiva came and taught that the verse states, "And your brother shall live with you," indicating that your life takes precedence, over the life of the other. So just to explain that for a second, that last verse, how he gets that, the fact that the verse says, "And your brother shall live with you," means you have to take precedence. Why? Your brother can't live with you unless you're alive. If you're dead, the brother can't live with you. So he derives from this verse that there's actually an obligation that actually my life takes precedence first. That way, my brother can live with you. And again, this is coming from a completely different context. But the way that rabbinic literature often works is we read scripture and we understand it, but then we also find other meanings from it that apply elsewhere and have more global consequences. So that's the consequence here. So this is very interesting. We've got two conflicting positions. One says both drink, both die. One says no. The person, you take precedence. So the question that I want to ask here is basically, first of all, what is it about this that is interesting? What distinguishes Ben Petora from Akiva? And here what I'm asking about, I guess, is why is it, do you think, that Akiva thinks that your life takes precedent when Petora does not, right? There's a central issue here that they think makes a difference. Whether, I'm not going to spit it out immediately, but there's something here that, according to Ben Petora, this factor makes a or doesn't make a difference, whereas according to Akiva, it does. There's a factor here, and it's really not a fair question because it's very difficult unless you've read about this. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and answer it because it's not a fair question. How do you decide which one? Okay, yes, that's exactly good. Great. I spoke too soon. How do you decide which one drinks the water? And the question is, how do you decide that? There is a clue here, how you decide it. What is distinct about this situation here? Beginning, it's in the first two sentences. I'll give you, or the first two lines, I'll give you that hint. It's not about the context, meaning the setting. It has something to do with
Who has
the
possession?
water. Yes, very good. Excellent. Oops, it went back. I apologize. So who has possession? In this case, what we're dealing with, there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them. So the fact is that we're dealing here with an issue of ownership also. So one person, the person who doesn't own the water jug, for instance, can't steal that water, right? That's theft. So this is a different situation, right? In a sense that the person who took water was careful, or maybe they were careful how they drank while they were traveling. But the point is, one person is in ownership and another is not. And Ben Petora says that doesn't make a difference. Akiva says it does, right? Akiva says the owner, because he owns the water, is able to say my life matters, takes precedence according to this. Ben Petora says doesn't make a difference. But what's interesting about this here is the fact that what is not brought up are whose life is more important or whose life has made more of a difference. This is not discussed at all, right? The only factor here determining whether you live or die according to Akiva is ownership. So what this is about really is what we call deontology. This is an ethical stance, essentially, or one branch of ethics. And essentially what it says, I'm not going to read this slide all the way, I'll leave it there for you to read, but it says that an act in and of itself is either moral or immoral. Ends don't matter, meaning ends don't justify the means must justify the ends. And in this case, right, the fact that they don't discuss, and I apologize, that is my dog, the fact that they don't discuss whose life would make more of a difference suggests that this is what's undergirding this here, right? Deontology, right? That the act of saving life in and of itself is important. And in fact, if you go back, I'll go back for a second, the fact that Ben Petora says it's preferable that both of us die, that is an extreme deontological position. Why? Because in and of itself, right, to give the water to one person or favor it over another is to condone the other one to death. And I think from that perspective, right, it doesn't feel right to us, I think, at least to me. Maybe it feels different for other people, but it doesn't feel right. How do we choose, right? It's better that we don't choose and make this terrible decision, and that both of us have a little bit of time together. And this is an excruciating situation but this is, I think, what's going on here. So we've got this one perspective, deontology. Okay. And exactly, this is, we already actually answered this question. This is a rabbi from the early 20th century, Israeli, who said that the main difference here is that it's about who takes precedence over the other, right? That here it's because the brother lives with you that he takes precedence, and then we get into the deal of ownership. But I'm going to keep going since we answered that question already, actually. Yeah. Okay. So now we have this other physician who's actually still alive. He's a major giant in medical ethics. He wrote the encyclopedia, actually, on Jewish medical ethics. And here's what he says. There are numerous strategies to determining priority, such as drawing a lottery or first come, first serve, such that whoever the doctor encounters first receives treatment first. There is justice in both of these approaches since it is random and seems to give an equal chance to everyone, but it is less ethical in that such approaches do not take into account various degrees of injury, overall saving of life, or the saving the many for the few. And the reason I bring this here is because the deontological perspective works well and is good, and I think feels good for a lot of people. And it works well in particular when we're on what's called a micro scale, right? This deals with micro allocation. When we are dealing with smaller communities and we actually have time and can actually, distribute things in a way that's equal, we can do that. But there comes a certain point, I think, and I'm going to argue this also, where that becomes somewhat, not necessarily illogical, but it's not feasible. On a macro scale, how do we possibly just make sure every single person in the world gets the same amount of vaccine, gets the same amount of water, right? It's too complicated. The logistics make it impossible. Situations are constantly changing. As soon as I give food to, or as soon as we deliver a massive amount of food to this one country, another country might need it back more, right? So macro allocation poses more complex questions in this sense. And what we're dealing with now is a matter of macro allocation, right? So deontology works good, but now we need to take other factors into consideration. Okay, let's keep moving. Where's my mouse? Okay. And the first consideration we're going to take into account is need. And we're running out of time, which is okay, but I'm going to leave this here for you to read, but I am going to summarize it. Essentially, what we see is that the person who takes precedence is a person who has more need, whose life is more in danger, okay? This is good both on a micro level and a macro level. On a micro level, it's pretty easy often to tell who needs help more, whose life is more at risk. On a macro level, what we see in America and throughout the world often is that we have developed these different groups, right? Elderly people, for instance, are in a high priority group. Why? Because the immune system is not as effective as it was when they were younger. That's one reason. There tend to be more comorbidities with age. People tend to have more diseases. So just by that fact, there is a greater threat, a greater risk of loss of life. So one way that this helps us is it shows us that when we deal with macro allocation, we need to deal with this in terms of whose life is most in danger. And we build categories based on that. And according to that hierarchy, that determines who gets vaccinated first, second, third, so on and so forth. And now this raises the question, should people battered by poverty and beaten by the batons of racist policies or healthcare workers and those on the front lines have priority? And I think the answer to this is twofold. This is one question, but the answer has two different justifications, I think, in Jewish law. The first question, or the first part of the question, right, dealing with people who are oppressed, the answer is yes, I think. Why? In terms of Jewish medical ethics, I think one can quite simply say that these are the people whose lives are also most at risk, right? People who are minorities, who are in the low, have occupy lower socioeconomic statuses, people of color. In general, what we know just from statistics and from trends, right? They have less access to healthcare, or have more comorbidities. We know for a fact, for instance, the number of Black people, I think, who have contracted COVID and have died, the ratio between that number and white people who have died doesn't even compare, right? So from a certain perspective, we could simply say, yes. Why? Because their lives are more in danger. This is the same reason why elderly people, I think, are higher priority. We can even argue now, also having established that, from justice, purely the perspective of justice, right, that it's important. The fact that injustice has been done to them so much. So there are multiple ways of attacking this problem, but I think we do have an obligation to them from this perspective. Rabbi Elliot Dorff, whom I mentioned earlier, has also come to the same conclusion. And obviously, I don't do this by myself, right? I use other people. So I heard him speak, and this is one of the things I drew from him. But he gave this insight when at a hospital that he's involved in California. And they developed some sort of protocol to make sure that these type of people have priority. And now we deal with a different question, though. Healthcare workers on the front lines. And I think this is different because they're not necessarily sick, right? So this is where it gets really tricky, right? Whose life is in danger? Is it a person who is already sick, already somewhat immunocompromised and suppressed, that if they contract the virus, they're almost, it's not going to be good? Or is it people who are healthy, but are around people who are not healthy, or around people who have COVID and could easily contract COVID and then spread that COVID to other people? Whose life is more threatened? Or maybe that's not actually how we should approach the problem. Maybe we should take a different tact. I think that's what happens here. So again, I'm not going to read this, but I will leave it up here for you to read. What this is talking about is precedent in the Mishnah, right? And it establishes a priority where a man takes precedent over a woman in terms of saving life and restoring something lost. This is patriarchal, right? I fully admit that and understand that. This was created in a patriarchal society. Men are not as important as women in this society. But what underlies here is interesting and I think helpful. The reason a man takes precedent over a woman, according to many commentators, is because a man fulfills more religious obligations than a woman. In traditional Judaism, men perform and are obligated to fulfill time-bound mitzvot. Women are not. It's just how it is. So from that perspective, they have a religious obligation in a sense that they are, I don't want to say holier, but there's more to do. This can be interpreted, I think, in terms of utilitarianism, which I'm going to get to right now. And this holds essentially that an action is right depending on the outcome. This is the opposite of deontology. It's not that the ends justify the means. I'm sorry, excuse me. It's not deontology where the means justify the ends. This is the ends justify the means. So what does this mean? Men go first because they have this role to fulfill that women don't. So the means that they go first justify the ends, the role that they fulfill. Okay. So this isn't a happy feeling, positive feeling here, right? Necessarily, or by any means. It's not at all, right? This isn't a nice text, especially to how we think, right? Women and men are equal. All people are equal. But that's not how we're approaching this problem, at least from the sources. But what it does show is there's this hint of utilitarian thought of the means justifying the ends. And this becomes, I think, extremely helpful when we're dealing with medical ethics at a macro scale. Why? So this is another similar text, but it takes it a step further. It's not only about a man now. It's also about a priest who is acting as a chief chaplain or a warrior, essentially, in a war. And what this shows us is that the warrior, we save the chief chaplain more than we save the high priest. And this is somewhat different, right? We would expect the high priest to be saved because of the function and the knowledge of Torah. But here it's actually flipped, because the function that's most important is the chief chaplain. Why? Because the survival of the community is at stake. And this is what's so important. Who is a chief chaplain today? Healthcare workers. If we don't save healthcare workers, the community is at stake. Quite simply, right? They are the ones who are finding cures. They are the ones who are administering the vaccines. They are the ones who are saving lives. So I think what we can say is that, at least from, if we want to look at this from a Jewish perspective, from a Jewish medical ethical perspective, it is a stronger argument to say that healthcare workers have been granted equal priority with the elderly, or in some cases, I think, higher priority, because of utilitarian reasons. We need them. It's quite simple, right? If we just do elderly first and other things like that, it could work. But there's a certain scale at which it's not enough to say that, okay, everyone's equal. Well, okay, that's all well and good, but then if everyone dies, it's not helpful, right? I'm obviously speaking in extremes, but there is this sense that there's a certain point where the end, or what we need, is what's most important, right? We need a community, we need life, we have to save life. How do we do that? We do that by saving the most lives. We do that by putting healthcare workers first. So I think that is a stronger argument or understanding of why that's been going on, at least from a Jewish ethical perspective. But again, the deontological perspective is also quite strong here as well, because they're also very much at risk. So what I want to conclude with, essentially, and then leave some time for questions, what do we take away from this? I think the first thing is the supreme value of life in Judaism, right? The questions that we asked: do we have an obligation to get vaccinated? Do we have an obligation to save life? Do we have an obligation to put people who are more at risk first, people who've been oppressed, or people who have faced injustice, or more at risk of contracting and then dying? All of those issues, the deciding factor is always the question of life. Life is of supreme value, and that dictates always how we approach the question and how we end up with a question. Our justification, not the end up with the question, excuse me, find our response. Whatever our justification is, it always revolves around that central issue of life, the supreme value of life. Do we maximize it? Is the supreme value of life about equality? Not clear, and maybe the answer is different in different situations. What I've claimed here, at least, and I think is important to understand, is that when we're at a micro level, the real, at least in many medical ethics cases from Judaism, the real idea is that equality is first, and that if need be, right, if, for instance, we have two people who have the same need level, who are exactly the same, how do we decide who gets a life-saving treatment? We use a lottery. Why? Because we can't choose. Because people are equal. Each life has value that is infinite. So that's the first bit. But when we get to a macro level, what I'm arguing is that helps in a certain way, right? But we have to do something, right? We can't just say, okay, everyone's equal. The world's too big. It doesn't work like that. So there is a certain point where we need other guidelines. One of them that we talked about, need, is in keeping with the equality one. If everyone is equal, how to decide who needs it more? Well, people who are more at risk. That makes sense, right? We're not saying they're more important, but they're more likely to die. So yeah. But the fact is, what I think is so interesting is that healthcare workers have been placed first quite frequently. And that, I don't think, follows the deontological perspective. It follows the utilitarian one. It follows the idea that we need to save the most life we can, and we need to save life. And how do we do that? We save those who are saving lives. So what does this mean for us? One, if you haven't been vaccinated, I hope you get vaccinated. or if you're hesitant to, please do. Two, I think it also places questions on us of how we manage our own responsibilities, right? Where should we donate our money, our time, our love, maybe even, right? In this case, we're talking about vaccines, but the issues are larger. Each day, we have time in our day, and we can do with it what we like. Is our time our own? Do we have to do something to help other people? What do we do with our money? Do we have to donate it? These are all questions about basically what makes an ethical life. And from a Jewish perspective, at least with medical ethics, there are obligations to help other people. And if we were to get into these issues about money and time, we could also discuss those as well. But I hope everyone enjoyed this and that it was insightful and meaningful. And I welcome questions.
I just have a comment.
Please.
Thank you so much. This is actually, I participate in a lot of these Zoom sessions, but I never have a voice. I felt really responsive to this session, and it really hit home. I've been fortunate. I fall in the range of the over 70, and I've gotten my vaccines. I feel the same way as far as the healthcare workers. Certainly, even if they're healthy, they come into such contact and they're saving lives, and my hat off to them. And fortunately, my kids, they're not kids, they're adults, working adults, and they deal with the public every day. But one is a healthcare worker, and she's gotten her shots. My son works for Trader Joe's, and he's in contact constantly.
Yeah.
He just got an appointment for this Friday, and I breathe a sigh of relief, because now 4 out of 5 of us will be vaccinated by Passover, and maybe this year we'll be able to have it together. But this was a wonderful presentation, and I thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad that you enjoyed it, that you felt responsive, and I'm glad that you've been able to get vaccinated, and that your family is in the process of doing that, and hopefully you will be together for Passover. That'd be wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'll ask the one I had. I saw
Sure.
on the news last night, I think it's happening nationwide, but especially in Colorado. In our surrounding states, there is immunization for people with one pre-existing condition. Recently, it opened up here if you have 2 pre-existing conditions, and we're moving along in the phases, so it's opening up to restaurant workers and teachers and people like that. A lot of people have crossed state lines
Yes.
to get a vaccine. What are the ethics around that? Someone made an argument that they drove 12 hours to Texas, or whatever the length is, to get the vaccine, drove right back. And his justification was that he is helping us get to herd immunity. I think there's a flip side to that, which is you're potentially taking a shot in a state that you don't live in that wasn't necessarily designated for you. What are your thoughts about the ethics there?
That's a great question. I have read, so this is, it's not the same thing, but it is connected to it. There's this question of cutting lines, partially because we have, at least in the United States, right, there are vaccines that are going bad. I think, I don't know if this is still the case, but I know at least in the area that I am in, that was the case at one point. And then if that's the case, can you jump ahead and get your vaccine if no one else is going to get it? And according to one scholar, the answer there is yes, just because if no one's getting it, right, if there's a vaccine that's going to go bad, then it's just going to go bad. You're not stealing it from anyone. But what you're talking about is a very different situation. I think that, so for the first part, the only way, if the person doesn't have a pre-existing condition, right, and shouldn't be, isn't that high priority and is crossing state lines just to get it, that's wrong, obviously. If the person does have a pre-existing condition, though, and is higher on priority, and they're going to a state where for some reason they will get the vaccine earlier than they would in the state that they're actually a resident in, which I think is what you're really asking about. I think the answer is I would agree with you, right? That you are most likely taking away from the other person. The reason I'm saying this is because one of the sources that I looked at when I was preparing this, the question of macro allocation, like I said, is different than micro allocation. And one of the ways it does that is because we deal with community level things, right? It's not just a matter of who am I close to, it's a matter of how do we organize communities. And one of the sources talks about soup kitchens. And the question is, if you have a person come in who doesn't live in that city, but has just moved there, right? And then there are other people who do live there, right? Who gets services, essentially, right? And what they say is essentially that there's a process, it has to take time. The person who lives in that area gets the services. Eventually, the person who moved there will get them, right? First, they become part of the community and other things. And I'm grossly oversimplifying this because there are other services offered, right? Like I actually might be, the soup kitchen actually, yes, is the answer, but the question is about communal fund. That's a different thing, right? So you can get services from the soup kitchen, but the communal fund, I think, is the one that you don't initially. But the point is here that we take care of our own community first, according to the halakha. And what that means then is, in this case, what you're talking about is someone who doesn't live there coming in and essentially stealing from that community, in a sense. I think that you could say this from the halachic perspective, having, talking about these other sources, that's what's happening. And you're doing it in a way, right? It's not that the state is choosing to give it to another person. I don't think that obviously you fill the forms out and you tell them where you're from, but I don't think they're actually looking at their list saying, okay, you're not from here, I'm going to give this to you anyway. I think what it really is that they're kind of blending into the community and they're being given it as if they are part of it, which from the Jewish perspective, right, you don't do that, I think.